Hi, I'm Dr. Vivek Murthy.
Thank you.
On December 15, 2014, when I began my tenure as Surgeon General, I didn't expect that my focus as the nation's doctor would involve the issue of loneliness. And yet, as I would discover, loneliness is a root cause and contributor to many of the epidemics sweeping the world today, from alcohol and drug addiction to violence to depression and anxiety. Loneliness is affecting not only our health, but also how our children experience school, how we perform in the workplace, and the sense of division and polarization in our society. I found few issues elicited as much visceral interest from both very conservative and very liberal members of Congress, from young and old people, and from urban and rural residents alike as loneliness did. It was something so many people have known themselves or have seen in the people around them. It's a universal condition that affects all of us directly or through the people we love, especially now more than ever. The good news is that the antidote to loneliness, human connection, is also a universal condition. We have evolved to participate in community, to forge lasting bonds with others, to help one another, and to share life experiences. In fact, we are hardwired for connection, as we demonstrate every time we come together around a common purpose or crisis. Such was the collective action of the Parkland High School students in South Florida after the 2018 mass shooting at their school, which claimed 17 lives. We also see this instinct in the outpouring of aid and assistance by volunteers that follows major hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes around the globe. Our community instincts remain alive and well. When we share a common purpose, when we feel a common urgency, when we hear a call for help that we were able to answer, most of us will step up and come together. In this series of videos, I'll investigate questions such as, what has led to such high levels of loneliness? How can we overcome the stigma of loneliness and accept that all of us are vulnerable? How can we create stronger, more enduring, and more compassionate connections in our communities? How do we shift the balance of our lives from being driven by fear to being fueled by love? My hope is that what you are about to hear will deepen your awareness of your own place in our social universe, and also inspire and encourage you to reach out to those around you with a renewed sense of the vital role we all play in one another's lives. As you'll see, when we strengthen our connection with one another, we are healthier, more resilient, more productive, more vibrantly creative, and more fulfilled.
Oh, sorry. Yay!
What an audience we have.
All right, so while I get this back up, we are going to go ahead and start with Clay giving an overview of the book. And certainly I want to remind the audience, feel free to request a copy of the book following this discussion, and we will make sure that that is provided for you. Okay, and those who are joining us from Zoom, if you could please put any comments or questions in the Q&A feature, that would work the best for us. Thank you.
So good afternoon, and thank you guys for being here, both here in person and also those of you who are joining online. This book and this topic, I think, are so timely given all of the events that are happening today. And Vivek Murthy, when he became Surgeon General for the second time, he had gone on a listening tour around the country. And he anticipated hearing about many different issues that he should focus on during his first tenure as Surgeon General. But what he really heard, and what he heard again the second tenure he's had, has been this issue of loneliness. And let me make sure that we are defining this appropriately. Loneliness, in his vernacular and his thoughts, is where your expectations of social connectedness and your feeling of belonging and being seen and being recognized and being valued the expectation is not met by the experience. And with that, he really makes the point, I think in a beautiful way, that loneliness is really just another face of fear and anger and envy and all of the traits that we identify eventually with our sort of fight or flight instinct, which is of a tone of our sympathetic nervous system. And he really makes a great point in the book, and I think it's relevant to the other topics that we've considered so far, which is purpose and then grit or resilience, in that when you're separated from your group, when you don't feel like you belong, it makes you feel very uncomfortable, which then creates a wariness or a lack of trust, a hypervigilance in trying to protect yourself. And this apparently goes back to our evolutionary times when you got separated from your group. You were at that time in true life-threatening conditions because the group really protected each other and fed each other. And we have maintained those reflexes all the way through our current situation. And when we start to look at the impact of not just acute stress, like where the fear response is elevated, but chronic stress where we live in this hypervigilance, this overdriven of our fight or flight response, our survival response, our sympathetic nervous system, then what we find is that we become sick, we gain weight, and we die early. And in fact, it's interesting when you look at longevity studies, if we get this back to the impact of our perception and how we see ourselves and see the world, and then our health, what we find is people that are the longest lived people in the world are generally the people that have the most satisfying social connections throughout their life. And so when you start to look at the impact of food and exercise and smoking and other things, as you keep getting older, those elements kind of fade away. And it turns out that maintaining close connections is the most important finding in almost every longevity study that's been done. And so the strength of our relationships is so important. Renée Brown, who talks about shame and vulnerability and is an author and a series of works that we will explore in the next part of our series and after the holiday break, but talks about shame and vulnerability. And it's really interesting when you look at about 5 different separate studies and you start to study what is the thread that ties together a lot of studies that make predictions on our lowered lifespan. And remember, through the COVID pandemic, the United States has lost about 5 years of life expectancy, which is the most lifespan that we've lost since the turn of the century relative to other westernized countries. And we've lost about 2.7 life years from the beginning of the pandemic to now. But we were losing life expectancy even before the pandemic started. And when we look at the impact on our state, we find that West Virginia has the second lowest life expectancy in the country at about 72.8 years, and only Mississippi at about 71.4 years, I believe, it has a lower life expectancy. And a recent study that just came out really kind of fortifies what Vivek Murthy tells us, which is a study that looks at a group of people, 20,000 people that have been followed since their adolescence now into their 30s. And the authors did a really neat study on this group of people. And what they did is they asked them to rate 4 categories that impacts their social perspective. And that is, what is their income? Does it meet their goals and their expectations? Education, meet goals and expectations. Job, do they have a job? And then 4, do they have social standing? Do they have social prestige, so-called social capital? And remember, in previous studies from Princeton, Ann Case and Angus Deaton found that there's a group of people pre-COVID that 45 to 55 years old who had high school education or less, that were white, non-Hispanic folks, that were dying at a rate that hadn't been seen since the peak of the AIDS epidemic, and they were dying of hopelessness and despair. And the biggest correlation was to people in the Appalachian region and Ohio River Valley. And it turned out that the critical factor was the loss of jobs and the loss of being cared about, being seen as valued and valuable. Well, in this new study that was done in these adolescents in their 30s, if you scored low on your composite, which made up of 4 things, again, income, job, education, and social capital, but more specifically, if you scored low on income or social capital, then the impact on your health was like smoking 15 cigarettes or more a day. And what happened was they measured genetic profiles, and they found that these people were in hyper defensive mode. So they had a lot of inflammatory genes that were waiting to activate their systems to fight or flight. They had gene profiles that showed that they were aging early, and so-called senescence genes. They had metabolic genes that were consistent with diabetes and with weight gain. And they also had lowered immune genes, interferon gamma, which has been shown to be a really critical feature of people that have gotten really sick and died of COVID, having not the inability to activate that particular gene pathway. And then they looked at a bunch of chronic diseases, including Alzheimer's, heart disease, cancer, hypertension, and these people started to resemble those categories as well. So maybe this is the first sneak peek at people that are going to develop these chronic diseases. And the interesting finding is all these people, the more negative they reported on those surveys of how they felt about job, income, social setting, the more they weighed. So when we start to look at states with or places that have obesity, chronic disease, then we can pretty much guess that that's a population that may feel really disconnected, may not feel valued, may feel lonely, and may feel that they have to protect themselves. And that also interferes with trust, that interferes with pleasure. So I think that what we are starting to see is maybe this is a central mechanism to how the health of our country and our state has trended down, our lifespan has trended down. And in this way, though, we have solutions, and those solutions are to reconnect, to make sure that everybody feels valued and feels welcome and feels that they matter just because they are part of our human community. And so to me, this is something that I hope that we can start here. But the impact of this book is not just to remind us how powerful our own social connections are, but it does do that, but also how universal the need for connections and to feel valued and to feel valuable in our own lives, which may then be the center of our health and well-being and longevity for the future.
Great. Thank you very much for the comments. So we will now turn it over to Renee, who's going to talk a little bit about the difference between being alone and loneliness and provide some examples.
So it was funny. I was talking to a friend and I said, I'm doing this seminar series. It's really great. And she said, what are you talking about? And I said, loneliness. And she said, do you really think you should do that? You just went away for a weekend to a cabin in the woods by yourself. And I had gone away to a cabin in the woods by myself to do some writing and to work on some poems. And so I really started to think about Murthy's book. And he has a whole section where he talks about the difference between loneliness and solitude or being alone. So I'm going to read his definitions because they're beautiful. So loneliness is the subjective feeling that you're lacking the social connections you need, right? So you can be in a room full of people and lack the social connections. Like physical proximity doesn't really equate to being lonely or not, right? However, solitude is a state of peaceful aloneness. I love that so much, right? An opportunity for self-reflection and a chance to connect with ourselves without distraction or disturbance. And then he adds this: solitude is not burdened with shame. And I'm like, you are so talking my language, right? And I think that that sense of solitude is something that we all need, like, especially when we think about burnout, right? We need that time to deeply connect with ourselves, space to be creative, space to wonder and explore and do those things, so that when we engage with other people, we're being our authentic selves, right? Loneliness is different, right? If you go to that cabin in the woods to just escape having to see anyone, and that's where it ends, right? That might be a different situation. And I think this is really an interesting concept, that there's a difference. I've brought a poem because poems by Grace Schulman, and I'm not going to read it because it's a kind of long poem, but it is called American Solitude. And she begins with a sort of calling to Edward Hopper. And Edward Hopper was an artist who is probably the foremost chronicler of loneliness. Nighthawks is a great painting you can Google and really get a sense of it. And she starts with this town and these very lonely people. And then about mid-poem, there's the volta. You're going to all learn poetry terms today. And the volta is the turn in the poem where things change. And there's a woman, and she's, I believe, looking for clams, something in the water there. And it changes from alone to solitude. And it's just beautiful. So I've brought copies here, and Gina's going to drop it in the chat or Q&A for those of you on Zoom. But I think this is a really lovely illustration. You know, I think it's also interesting that in literature, we see loneliness used as a punishment. Like, I was thinking about the Scarlet Letter, and I'm like, yeah, loneliness is a punishment. And I'm like, we should really think about that. One last thing that I want to bring up is also loneliness and social media, right? Because we have all these social media tools, right? And they're supposed to be tools that we can use for connection. Yet somewhere in this, we've kind of lost this idea of connection. And Murthy had some really interesting things to say about social media. One is the feedback loop pace. I mean, it's like so fast, right? And we totally buy into it. Oh my gosh, I posted this thing. Oh, did I get some likes? Did I didn't get some likes? What's going on here? Oh no, right? And then on these platforms, you see this like perfectly curated, magnificently presented sense of reality that's like really like an unreality, you know, not always, but often. And I don't want to say that there can't be true connection through social media. You know, I've used it some, and I've found some really great connections that way, especially with poets and writers that I would otherwise not have that connection to. But one of the things that happened during the pandemic is that there was this woman, a poet, and she decided she was going to blast out a poem over Twitter every day. And she had so many poets in line to do this. She actually did several a day, right? And so I don't want to just say like that it's bad, but the way that it's manifested itself. And the thing that Murthy cautions us, and I love this, is that he says, our time is social media's money. And that's also really important to think about.
Thank you for your insight. We always love to hear your stories in relation to the book to life. And we did post in the chat, Katie put the link to the poem. So for those of you who are joining us via Zoom, please take a moment to spend some time reading that this afternoon. So now we're going to turn it over to Bill, who is going to lead us in an exercise and relate a mindfulness activity to the topic of loneliness that we're discussing today.
Well, welcome everybody. One of the interventions that's been shown to improve loneliness is mindfulness. And I like to think of mindfulness, if I don't lose my voice here, as a set of skills that can be learned and practiced. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to guide you in a mindfulness practice right here in your seats. You don't have to sit on the floor or do anything special. And what we're going to do is the technique, the guided practice of nurturing positive emotions, or really just feeling good. So if you could just assume a position that you can be comfortable in for about a 5-minute meditation here. We'll begin by lengthening our spine, and our eyes can be open or closed. We'll loosen the jaw, the face, and the shoulders. And you might take in a deep breath and breathe out and just easily settle into your posture. Lengthen and loosen. And take a moment to notice your overall emotional feeling, tone, or valence. Are you feeling pleasant, unpleasant, a little of both, or neutral? Also, notice your state of arousal. Are you feeling calm or tranquil, or anxious or agitated? However you feel right now is okay. Noticing our feelings builds the skills of sensory clarity. And practicing being okay with our feelings develops equanimity. And now let's try, excuse me. Let's try some mindful interventions. So bring a slight smile, just a little gentle smile to your face. And you might notice a subtle arising of pleasant feelings locally surrounding the smile. The feeling might be a pleasant, warm glow in the whole face. Or perhaps you might notice a warm, comfortable feeling spreading to your chest. Notice wherever the good feelings appear and dwell there in that experience. This strengthens our skill of concentration. And let's use a different technique for calling up a positive emotion. Can you recall a joyful experience where you felt really connected with a loved one or perhaps with a pet? It could be an image of a place or an event. It might be vivid with images and sound, or just a static image. Anything is fine. And bring your attention to the emotional spaces in the body. We We enhance our sensory clarity when we notice where our emotions show up and with soaking into the details of the experience. If you find your attention wandering to other experiences like thought or sounds, that's okay. Just let them come and go in the background. Soon, when we want to feel good, we'll automatically remember to practice the skill of evoking and detecting and savoring these pleasant feelings of positivity. You can open your eyes when you're ready and maybe stretch out a bit. Reclaim my voice here. So you might wonder why positive emotions? Why did we focus on that? What does that have to do with loneliness? Well, obviously, when we feel good, we're much more likely to connect with other people. So that's one of the reasons. But I also said this was a set of skills that we were going to learn. Yeah, thank you. A set of skills that we're going to learn. And so to learn those skills, you need to practice. And if you have a positive experience when you meditate, you're more likely to come back and practice again. So those are a couple of the good reasons for that. And why mindfulness in general for dealing with loneliness? Well, it's one of the few interventions that's been studied with some randomized controlled trials. The downside of it is a lot of what's been done are long-term, like taking 8 weeks of training, several hours a day in a retreat. And those have been shown to be effective in reducing loneliness and social connections. But more recently, the researchers up at Carnegie Mellon have studied this with an app so that you can have an experience where you have an in-person experience, which is reinforced by a couple of weeks of application training and practice. And the interesting thing that they showed there was it wasn't just the calming effect of having mindfulness, but also the acceptance piece was extremely important with that. And so if you think about how that might work, Dr. Marsh might ask me a question, and all of a sudden my self-talk goes off. And I said, oh my God, he's asked me a question. I might not be able to answer it. What's he going to think of me? He won't invite me to any of his parties anymore. I'll be a social outcast. On the other hand, and so with practicing mindfulness, I can be aware of those things in real time. On the other hand, I might have thought a totally different thing. I might have thought, oh, he values my opinion, and I can feel good and I feel connected. So by being aware of those things and accepting it, say in the first case, accepting that, it's like, oh, that's probably not true, or it doesn't really matter anyway, it's just a fleeting thought in my mind. I can be more capable of being open and connected to other people. And I guess one of the third ways is a lot of times you spend meditation in solitude. And as we've pointed out, getting comfortable with solitude is quite helpful.
Thank you very much. You probably all agree that was a great 5 minutes of the day, kind of, especially at this time of the day. It was a wonderful reset. And it is amazing how you can kind of offer that even when we're in a room filled with other individuals. So this brings us to the portion of the afternoon where you all get an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. So I do have a microphone because we have a Zoom audience as well. So if you don't mind asking your question into the microphone if you're in the room, or I can repeat it if you're not comfortable with that. Okay, so I will take questions of our panelists. I knew I could count on you, Jan. I knew.
So I have a question for really all three of you, which is, I grew up in a very social era when, the phone was on the wall in the kitchen and you were connected to the phone with a cord, and having a phone call was a social event, and having a lot of discussions in person with other humans was a daily event. Now with social media, and certainly with the disruptor of COVID, how do you invoke in your kids? Because I see my children who are young adults sitting in a room, three of them, all staring at their phones and not having conversation, but you become the ogre when you say, put your phone down for a little bit. And it's almost like, I'm not a child anymore, So how do you invoke that desire to have social connections that are very different from this?
That's a killer question. I love it. I also like when you talked about the phone on the wall with the cord. And I remember the princess phone. Anybody remember? I remember being about 14, 15 years old, and I just wanted that princess phone. The good news for you is if I don't have a satisfactory answer, there's actually a whole section in Murthy's book that talks about this, especially with children. It's towards the end of the book, and it's fantastic. One of the things that I've done is teach other dancers. As many of you know, I was once a dancer, and in a dance studio, you cannot have your phone. You have to be in the moment, right? There's all your other belongings besides your body are in another room. I love activities like this. I think soccer, youth soccer's like this, you can have your bag and it can have your phone, and it's on this place called the sidelines, and you're playing the sport. And even if you're not into those kind of activities, I think even walks in nature, White Park is close to where I live. I'm in White Park all the time. It's just great to be out there. But to your point, this idea of social connection, my great grandmother lived to be 97 years old. And every single day at 5 o'clock, she had her cocktail hour. She had exactly one cocktail and a plate full of cheese and crackers. And she would sit on her porch, and anybody could come by and sit with her. And I remember this very clearly because I was very small, and she made me a Shirley Temple, and it had 2 cherries in it, not just one cherry, 2 cherries. And, when you're 7, 2 cherries makes a big impression on you. But now as an adult, I realized that was, she was older. That was a way for social connection. Neighbors came by, family came by. And it was a moment for her to pause in her day. I don't know what the modern equivalent of my great grandmother's cocktail hour is, but if you can figure that out, you should definitely write a book about it.
I'll follow up if that's okay, Bill. You can go next. I think that is a really important question. And in the book, but also in other work, I think what's really important for most of our children is that they have good interpersonal relationships with at least a few people. And it can be as few as one caring person that can make the biggest difference. You know, life is different than when we grew up. We were much less mobile. We stayed in one place. We had our neighborhood. All of the parents watched out for all the kids. So you knew that your parents had extended vision on where you were and what you were doing and all this. But I don't think it's necessarily bad. You know, in the book together, Vivek Murthy points out that a lot of relationships that are online are thin relationships, so they're not very stable. And a lot of the social media is about trying to impress your friends and sort of have the best life on in your peer group. And of course, everything's curated appropriately for the best life view of our existence. But the truth is, for a lot of children, and we saw this during COVID too, there's really strong relationships that can be really, you know, supported by online things, whether it's playing video games together, whether it's chatting. You know, a woman I know who ended a long-term relationship says that you know, back dating again, everybody's texting everybody, and I wasn't exactly sure what to do with that. And so you know, things have changed a lot, and that's not necessarily good or bad, but I do believe that if you're substituting real relationships with fairly superficial online relationships, that's not going to be very satisfying. But if you have deep, good relationships with people that you connect with online, I think that can be very good. And the data, I think, would support that. But having a relationship with at least another person, preferably an adult, who demonstrates and helps you feel valued and valuable, particularly younger people, children. And it turns out that that's a really critical set of relationships and opportunities to really firm up the rest of your life from a health standpoint. And particularly, and this is true of all species, not just humans, but if you're not touched or stroked, which is what activates the oxytocin response, which is the trust response, the mother-baby response, if you will, then if you don't get touched and you're an animal or a human, your intellectual capacity doesn't get developed to its maximal. You become less healthy, and it turns out that you live less long, and you definitely live less well because you're struck from the beginning by not feeling safe in the environment. And that lack of psychological safety or feeling of physical safety is one of the drivers of that sympathetic nervous system chronic and overdrive, which to me is really what loneliness gives you, along with other sort of self-perceived, you know, value statements that you might make about yourself.
We have a question from our online audience. Often we're told to join a club, group, or committee. Is it more important to connect more personally when battling loneliness? Sometimes those, quote, groups turn into stressful duties, which I think this is a great question that we all can probably relate to.
Well, I can relate to that. What was the first part of the question? How do you?
Absolutely. Often we're told, join a
What
club,
should
group,
you
or
do it?
committee.
I guess
Basically,
it's
if
should
you're
you-
lonely, this is what you should do.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I think it's a balance. For me, I am a member of, you know, I'm now on the board president of my dog, the board of directors of my dog club, you know, and it causes a little more grief than I'd like, but I get to come together around, you know, a common bond of animals. So it's been really useful to me, but I try to balance that out, I guess. You know, what's the risk benefit ratio here?
I think that part of the question, which is a good one for me, is dependent on how you're put together as a person. And we know that there's people that are more introverts and there's people that are more extroverts. And as we think about introvert introverted people. And there's really a wonderful other book called Quiet by an author with the last name Kane. And she makes the point that, people that are introverted generally tend to like deeper relationships with fewer people, as opposed to perhaps more superficial relationships with many people. And so if you're oriented toward having deep relationships with people, then maybe instead of joining a club just to get connected, you try to use other venues, and that's really was the role of, community endeavors that, PTA and other, organizations or churches or other kind of clubs or gatherings where you find people that shared common experiences. The other thing is we've talked before about the anthropologist Robin Dunbar, and Robin Dunbar has helped us gain insights about the issues about connections and relationships and numbers. And that's because when we were evolving, we could only have a big enough group around us that we could feed each other, but big enough to protect each other. And that number, which is so-called Dunbar's number, is 150. But what he points out, and what Murthy, who interviews Robin Dunbar in the book, points out, is we spend on average about 60% of our social capital time developing relationships with between 10 and 15 people, about 12 people. And that's called the intimate inner circle. And then there's the middle circle, which is people that we have relationships with, but maybe not so deep. And that's the other 40% of our energy. And that gets us to about 150 people, which is his number. But we also have an outer circle of people we may not know very well, but we might recognize are part of the same thing we are. And that can push you to about 500 people, which is about the biggest circle that you can have. And if you think about places like ours that are thousands of people big, then that means that no matter how committed you are as leaders in the organization or members of teams, you can't know all the people here. So we have to create those easy to, walk in the door, join the party opportunities in different rooms with different conversations so that people can find where they are comfortable and feel safe, because we all really do need to belong. If not to a group with people, we need to belong and be connected to a purpose or a set of activities that motivates us to feel like we are really contributing in a positive way for our health and for our performance.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions from the audience and online. So that brings us to the end of our formal discussion together. Thank you all who are in our online audience. If you could please take a moment to fill out the post survey. For those in the room, if you scan the QR code, you can complete the post survey. We also will be sharing that if you want to share your contact information with Katie before you leave. For those individuals who are in the room, if you do the post survey, that also will give you access to a copy of the book if you are interested in receiving one. And so for those in the room, please join us for refreshments afterwards, and let's take a moment to thank our panelists today. That was great. You all were so timely. Yeah, that's good. Amazing.